mess with the IRS.
Yes, they do.
Let's try.
I do mess with it.
Let's begin. Good morning.
No, they don't.
Good morning. Good morning. I hear there's some questions here. Someone
We're just
wants
talking
to.
about
No one's obsession with my tefillin is getting out of hand.
it's non-kosher to fill it.
We'll try to keep the obsessions out of the room. Okay.
They're just really big.
All right. We talked about Phil in the other class. We're not going to repeat it again.
What did you do?
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome back to Yaakov. I'm glad you're healthy again. Yesterday we covered the laws of Ma'aser Behema. Previous day we covered the laws of Bechor Behema. And before that we covered the laws of, together with Bechor Behema, we also covered the laws of Peter Chamor. Peter Chamor, the firstborn of the donkeys. And before that we covered the laws of Reshit, of Zurah L'Chaya V'Keva, the gifts to the Kohen. All of these are gifts to the Kohen from animals. And the last one, which we have left to cover today, and then we'll move on, is the mitzvah of Reshit Hagez, the first of the shearings, when you shear the wool off the sheep. And if you have sheep, it can be practically, maybe even be a mitzvah d'oraita in the land of Israel, if you happen to have. So I'll give some of the laws now, but that's pretty much what we covered. Since you're not raising cattle, it's okay if you missed yesterday, and in the long run, you'll catch up sometime. And you can also watch the video from yesterday. I suggest putting it on double speed. I talk slowly. But when I was listening, someone sent me a link to a previous shir, the last week's shir on tefillah. Someone I haven't spoken to in 3 years, and they said, this popped up on my feed, the YouTube video. And I said, nice. I said, well, that's cool. I didn't know it was there and whatever. And so I tried to listen, and I had to put myself on double speed because I was too slow for myself. When I'm speaking and teaching, it's more natural. I have a speed, but when you're listening, and especially since I knew what I was going to say before I said it, at least the second time around. So definitely, it's good to speed things up. Reshit Hagez, you have to give. You saw the pasuk inside yesterday. The pasuk in Dvarim Yud Chet. The first of the shearings have to go to the Kohen, like the first of all of our produce. And we said it in the land of Israel, you have to have 5 sheep for you to be chayav in the shearings of those 5 sheep. From each sheep has to have enough there to be the value of 12 selas. We said yesterday it's only about 204 grams, which the average sheep has 2.5 kilos. So for sure you're going to have 200 grams of the sheep that we have now in the land of Israel. Reshit Hagez is the first of the shearings that you have to give to the Kohen. And if you have 5, you have to have a minimum of 5 sheep.
All right.
And then when you shear them, whenever you shear them, you give the first of the shearings to the Kohen.
Just to clarify, you mean the first of each sheep, or just the first shearing of all?
The first of the shearings, whether you shear them all or you shear one of them, whichever one gets sheared.
Gotcha.
The first little bit you give to the Kohen. And how do we do it today? So the problem is today in the land of Israel, if you have sheep, that the wool is very coarse.
So it's a standard sheep.
And it's usually not made for clothing. It's made for thicker threads. Now the Kohen doesn't really need that, raw wool.
He needs a new rug.
Maybe. Furthermore, when you shear the sheep, the value of the actual wool, the threads that you get out, is very, very minimal. The vast majority of the cost is for the labor. for shearing the sheep. And the reason why sheep are even sheared, for the most part, is to make it lighter for the sheep, to let a load off their back, literally, right? For them not to be sweltering in the sun. And therefore, usually the wool, the wool is given just as a fringe benefit to the people that are the workers. Because nobody really buys this stuff. The workers that's their business. So then if they gather enough of it, they have lots of shearings. So then they can actually, it's worth it for them to turn it into a usable product. But for the most part, the wool itself has so little value. Even if you're going to give a little clump to the Kohen, it's kind of useless for him. Not only that, if you actually give all of the wool to the shearers, to the workmen, then there's a machloket whether you're chayav to give the reshit hagez to the kohen yourself. The owner of the sheep doesn't own the wool. You've given it to the shearers. Now they might have an obligation to give their first shearings of the wool that they shear to the kohen. There's a machloket about that. But let's say you are chayav. There's another problem. The problem is we mentioned that in order to avoid the problem of bechor, we make sure that there's part ownership of the animal, like the ownership of the windpipe or the ownership of the ear, whatever, it gets owned by a non-Jew. So if the owner of the sheep is not only a Jew, so then you don't have this mitzvah of Reshit Hagez either. And so if you do want to fulfill this mitzvah, it is a mitzvah of the Torah. Some people say you make a bracha. Some people say you don't make a bracha. Because, and the question is, comparing this to the Zroa L'chaim V'Keva, comparing this to the Bechor, who does the mitzvah and when does the mitzvah happen? Does the mitzvah happen automatically? Like we said that the four limb and the cheeks and it belongs to the Kohen already. And the Bechor, of course, belongs to the Kohen when it gets born. As opposed to, we said, Maaser Be'emat has to be designated when, the 10th sheep out through the opening. So it has to be designated by the owner. What about the shearing? So it sounds like the shearing is not automatically holy, not automatically given to the Kohen, and therefore it's a mitzvah incumbent upon the owner, if there is a sole. If you want to fulfill the mitzvah, make sure that you are the sole owner of 5 sheep. And then you or your shaliach, when you do shear the sheep, you can give some to the Kohen, and he quotes here, Rav Melamed quotes the Rav Tzvi Yehuda, said you should make a bracha. It's a mitzvah in the land of Israel. You make a bracha and you give that little bit of the wool to the Kohen. The bracha is al netinat reshit hagez, giving the first of the shearings. Yesterday we spoke about the meaning that the first of all of your produce, everything that you should recognize that it comes from God, and also support the Kohanim. Maybe they need some textiles, as well as the bread that we give them, as well as the fruit which you give them, as well as the meat which you give them. So basically, all of the 5 food groups, or more than that, all of the necessities of life were provided for by the Israelites. They were providing for the Kohanim, who were their religious leadership, and that is all we're going to say about Reshit Hagez. We have some questions here.
I was wondering if, similar to challah, is there anything like once it's spin or woven, would there be anything that we would give to the Kohanim?
So you still have to give it, like by challah, we said ideally it's given when it's dough.
Right.
But if you bake it into a bread, you have to cut off some of the bread and give it to
Because
the
that could be
Kohen.
one.
Nowadays we have to burn it.
If you give a Kohen, you say, here's 3 yards of wool fabric,
It's kosher.
that's
It's
something
kosher.
more.
It's not ideal,
that's
but
more
it's
usable for them.
For sure.
Than
Yeah.
handing them a pile of wool.
That's right.
And then this is a backwards question, but it was making me think of this. When we have to take the tithes from the grain, and then we make the bread, and then we make the challah. Could it in today's world simply be better to grind grind it all up, make bread, and then say to the Kohen, these loaves are from the or the tithes from the grain, and then this loaf is from the challah,
Listen.
rather than giving them a sack of grain.
So you
Sure.
have to get a type from each challah.
So we learned about the laws of challah, that it goes by the doughs, but the doughs can be joined together through a basket or through putting on the same table with a towel on top of the table. There are ways that different doughs get joined up, but if they're not joined, each dough, you have to separate a little bit of challah.
My question wasn't that.
I understand, I was answering his question before I
Okay.
answered your question.
Okay.
Answering your question, listen, if we look at it practically now, first of all, we don't have any Kohanim to support in terms of that. There's no temple, and they're not, so we're working in the temple, and so, but we still have to keep the laws of the Torah. But we look at how the laws in the Torah were defined, and by Meiser it says when the processing in the field is done. That's when they're chayav Meiser. And by challah it says when you make a dough, you have to get done. And when you shear, it's the shearing. So each one has to be essentially in kind giving. When the value can be replaced for it, we do. We talked about by Zorah l'chayim and Keva, that we can give the value, that the Torah, that's the way the mitzvah were defined. Each mitzvah has its mechanism defined by the halacha, and we try to fulfill that. Another question?
If you have joint ownership of a sheep with another Jew, and then you split the.
You have to have enough 5 sheep for each one. So that's
So I was gonna say,
10
you do
sheep
what?
if you have 2 owners.
So I was going to say, do you do half the mitzvah? Because if there are 2 of you splitting
You both get to fulfill the mitzvah if you have 10 sheep. If you have 2 owners for only 5 sheep, then the mitzvah doesn't apply yet. It only applies on a Jew when he has the ownership of 5 sheep. Okay?
let's say he has 5 sheep, he's in a business with his friend who has 4 sheep. What does he happens then?
I guess neither one. I guess you look at the sum total, and each one has 4.5 sheep. So. Okay, that's the end. So we did that chapter now about the matanot, matnot kuna, min hachai, from the living, from animals. Now we're going to go back, since we've finished all of the matnot kuna. We did truma and meiser and challah and bikurim and all the other gifts we mentioned. We're going to go back to the plant life and talk about bal tashchit before we get into, as I said, the rest of the rules of kosher. So this is not really about kosher. This is about trees. You're not allowed to destroy trees. Bal tashchit. Or if you say it in Ashkenazis, bal tashchis.
So you're
It's the
not
same
allowed to
word,
destroy trees.
You're not allowed to destroy trees.
or-
Please open up your chumashim to Devarim. Devarim, chapter 20.
So you're not allowed to destroy trees for wood or for paper?
We'll talk about it in just a
20,
second.
you said?
Drawing 20.
That's Deuteronomy, right?
Deuteronomy, yeah.
Pasuk what?
19.
Alright, there.
What page?
I'm on 371.
Sorry, what
71.
371. Devarim 19. 20, verse 19.
Chapter 20 is in 370.
Chapter 20, verse 19.
Not to be particular.
That's right, go ahead and read for us.
that
Alright.
is
Hebrew, English?
English.
English, please.
Alright. When thou shalt besiege a city a long time and making war against it to take it, thou shalt not destroy the trees thereof by forcing an axe against them, for thou mayest eat of them, and thou shalt not cut them down. For the tree of the field is man's life, to employ them in the siege.
Tree is.
That's 19.
It's good, it's good.
Oh, I
Yeah.
thought we were doing 20. Oh, sorry, my
No,
bad.
no.
No.
Chapter 20, verse 19.
2019.
Oh, my bad.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So the tree supply fruit is what it's saying, and that's why you shouldn't destroy it.
That's correct. That's correct. That's a simple understanding. The trees have a very special place in Judaism. We're going to speak about it more when we get to
When
Tu
Jews
B'Shvat.
first enter, the first mitzvah they're given is to plant trees.
Turn to Devarim.
What about 20?
Actually, turn to Vayikra 19.
Alright.
Vayikra 19:23. It says, "V'chitavo el haaretz uneta'atem." First thing, when you come to the land, you should
224.
plant. Page 224. You see it, verse
Yeah.
chapter 19.
Vayikra 19, you said?
Vayikra 19, Parshat Kedoshim.
Yeah, but we're supposed to.
Pasuk 23.
Yeah.
224.
When ye shall come into the land.
And plant.
And shall have planted all manner of trees for food, then ye shall count the fruit thereof as uncircumcised.
Right, that's the mitzvah of
Orla.
Orla. We learned about it. We're not going to learn about it again now. I'm just mentioning to you that this is the Midrash says, what is the first thing that God did when he came into the land of the earth, created the world?
Sun and the light. No, that was the-
Connected to what we're talking about, it says that God planted a garden. He planted trees. So we plant trees like God planted trees. Planting trees for food is a primary archetype. And therefore, it's, the Khatam Sofer said, when you come to the land of Israel and plant trees in the land of Israel, you're fulfilling a mitzvah d'oraita, to plant in the land of Israel. Didn't we talk about this?
No, I mean, I did plan it, so I just want to make sure that I did the mitzvah.
So the truth is, the people who really fulfill these
Yes.
mitzvahs are the farmers who plant
23.
orchards filled with fruit, which, that's really where the food comes from, the
How do you say farmer in Hebrew?
Yeah, no, I was looking back, I'm missing a page, it's shocking.
Yeah, it does.
So trees are special. As we saw in the Dvarim, we saw that a man's life is like a tree.
They represent the circle of life, because they die in autumn and then they come back to life in spring.
Interesting, they don't really die. They don't really die. If they died, then they wouldn't come back to life.
I get it.
So they maybe lay dormant,
They hibernate, kind of.
but I think,
Well, it depends on the tree.
well, they bear fruit in cycles of winter and summer and spring. But I think the main point is that fruit slowly grow up to become fruitful. Right? They go through a process of
Right, that first year's fruits, they're not very good.
if there are any at all.
Yeah.
It's like, if you're an artist and you look back at your first paintings, they weren't very good. But you grow up, you get a little better and better.
And you're not allowed to cut them down, is that right? So we have this pear tree that. the pears
Exactly.
always get dry and wasps would-
So if you look again at Dvarim Chaf, it says when you come, now the context is when you're besieging a city, you're at war, and you're laying an ambush,
You're building a siege.
circling a city, what's that called? Siege. So don't cut down the trees, the fruit trees. Don't cut down the fruit trees. The truth is, all the commentaries say, well, if it's necessary for war, then, it's pikuach nefesh. You want to win the war, you can cut down the fruit trees if necessary. But first, if you can avoid it, first cut down the other trees, if you have to cut down any trees. If you can, don't cut down anything. But if you have to cut down trees, we see that the Torah has special emphasis on the fruit trees. Try not to cut down the trees. Some commentaries say, don't use that as psychological warfare against the people, right? Usually the way it worked is that you would live inside of the city, the dwelling area, residential area, and the fields where your produce came from was outside the city.
So don't cut down the fruits, but poison the water.
So it doesn't say you should poison the water. You made that up. That's interesting.
No, but it doesn't prohibit you from poisoning the water.
So the question is, what is the idea? Many commentaries say that in the ancient world, what they would do is they would sort of, as I said, psychological warfare. They'd cut down. They would burn the fields, and the people inside the city would basically realize that, okay, my livelihood is gone. And cutting down the trees was part of that warfare. It was everybody was in the city, sort of looking out and seeing. They could see what the army was doing. They could see, and there was. Read through Tanakh. There was noise that they made. There was battering rams which they brought. There was a whole
Trumpets.
right.
They're trying
Until
to get
modern
them-
day, there's parades. right, Yericho, they would parade it around the city 7 times. There was a whole
is that what we do?
psychological thing going on
Is that
here.
why under the chuppah, the wife walks around the man 7 times?
That's one interpretation. That's one
Is
interpretation.
that not what happens? Under
I
the
hope it's
chuppah?
not preparation for warfare, but
Rob, is that not what happens under the chuppah? The wife circles the man 7 times?
yes,
that
there is such a
Yeah.
custom.
Yes. No, well, you, Rabbi.
No, my sister-in-law did it. Is it every tradition to do that?
Only the Ashkenazi Jews.
Are you
It's
acting
gotta
out?
be some weird explanation.
Yeah, no, it is. My sister-in-law did it to my brother.
In any case, so there's different interpretations of the pasuk. Some people say, if it's part of the warfare and you need to eat, right? Why was the chain of supply is a big part when you're sending your army far off. That you have to feed your soldiers. So if the soldiers won't have what to eat, then they're not gonna be able to fight. So then you're allowed to. But so this gets us to the crux of the issue. Noam and Ariel and Shua. And that is that according to our commentaries on the Torah, the principal point here is you're not allowed to cut down the tree for no good reason. If there's no utility, if there's no benefit, then you're not allowed to. But if there is, like if it's pikuach nefesh, if you have to fight, if you need it for the sake of the war, then it's allowed. I'll take some questions. Just let me say, a few words in between, and I'd be happy to accept your questions. Yes, Moshe.
So, does it also have something to, like, for instance, it says in the Geneva Convention, among other similar legislations, that you can't do things that specifically target civilians.
Mm-hmm.
So is part of it that you can't cut down the trees because the impact of cutting down the trees will hurt the civilians more than it'll hurt the soldiers?
Makes sense. I like that connection. Yeah. But I want to focus more on the prohibition, not during wartime and not about war, but in general. From here, we learned the mitzvah that you're not even in civilian without any war whatsoever. If you have a fruit tree in your garden, you can't cut it down. You cannot destroy a fruit tree. And from here, really, the larger context which we should be thinking about this is, I believe, that here we have an anchor to speak about in the Torah, to speak about care for the environment. We know now that they just closed the conference in Glasgow of the world, what's it called?
Was that
Environment. I don't think it's shtuyot. I don't think it's shtuyot.
They had a like
Was
an
it called the
environment
global
convention,
environment? Yeah.
which everyone took private jets to.
That's-
Yeah.
That's a good one.
And where was America? Where was Russia? It's steel.
So they were all there. First of all, they were all there.
What- is
And
this
it
the
doesn't
most
mean it's
recent one?
shtuyot. I think you're wrong. No, I heard your opinion. I think you're wrong. I think that only somebody stupid would close his eyes to what the result of your actions are. At the very beginning of being a religious Jew, if you read the Mesilat Yesharim, he says you got to pay attention to your actions. And if it's true on a personal scale, it's also true on a global scale. And the fact that what we do as human civilization can affect the environment, it has been proven to the best of our ability.
What we should do if we really want to fix the problem is not to stop having cars or planes, to stop sending satellites into outer
No,
space,
but we need
ripping
that.
holes into the atmosphere every time we send something out into space.
So let me speak for a few more sentences, please, and complete the thought. I think that there's a lot of emotions on this issue. I'm hearing a lot of feelings that people are for and against, and the environmental movement, and there's a lot of debate about it. But I'm just trying to say, going back to the kernel of the idea, is that we were given, like if we go back to the trees in Gan Eden, what was the mitzvah that God gave to man?
Don't eat from the tree.
More than that.
Don't.
Eat from all the rest of the
He
trees.
said, your job is to care for the garden, tend to the garden. And from here, our rabbis learned the basic principle that we have to care for the world. We have to make sure that we don't take care, the Midrash says, do not harm and do not destroy my world. If it's true about nuclear weapons, it's also true about environmental influence. You can argue about
We have nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
dangerous. We have to take tremendous care not to destroy the world. So also we have to take care not to destroy the environment. We can argue a lot, and there's a lot of opinions about what's the best way to care for the environment. What's the best way to make sure that, and how much our actions influence the environment. There's carbon emissions, and there's a lot of science on the topic. But the principle, the core, is, and this is what this mitzvah is teaching us, is that do not destroy for no good reason what God gave us, and particularly it's mentioned in regarding the fruit trees. But the principle is that we have to have tremendous respect and care for nature and for the natural resources which God gave us. And I believe that there's a lot of science that how we treat the environment in terms of the trees, how many trees we cut down, and how we how much coal we burn, and all the different. There's a lot of science which says that there's a direct influence from our actions. It doesn't have to be as direct as taking what did the pasuk say? Taking an axe and cutting down a tree. That's direct influence. Well, obviously, we're talking about a larger global influence, but I believe that the principle is the same. The principle is to take care that your actions do not harm the world. Okay, now stop. I've said my piece. And again, we can argue all we want about how to do it, but the principle is there, and this is the basis of this mitzvah. Yes, please.
So it's kind of like an open-ended question, but like obviously, I don't think anyone is like in favor of like pollution and all that and everything.
Some people are.
I don't know. I hear lots of Listen, I own a car. I drive a car, so I pollute. But
Yeah.
of course, I pollute. Does that mean I'm not conscious of it? I do it without any care?
I understand.
Yes, go ahead.
But in this context of like
If you want to talk in your turn, you've got to let other people. We'll do one at a time.
in the context of this conversation about taking care of the world, I guess kind of the other side of it, what might be also that like Hashem gave us these resources to use in the world. So for example, he put oil or coal in the ground for us to extract and use for energy and stuff. So kind of how do we balance that out where it's like God provided us these resources for us to use. Also on the other side that these resources also have they have an effect on the world around us that be. So how
to balance.
kind of like how do we balance?
It's a good
out?
question. So I think the idea is we all know that nature is a living thing. It replenishes itself. Right? If you cut down a tree, it will regrow.
Yeah.
If you cut down, there's some elements in nature that
What about
Can-
non-renewable specifically, like things like
right. So that we have to balance off, versus the utility demand and the care for future generations, right? We got to try to plan for the future as well. But you're right, the details are very difficult, very complicated. But the concept is there is a way of benefiting from these natural resources without ruining the chances of the future.
Mhm.
If you do it slower, then nature has a chance to replenish itself. And if you just do it without any concern, then you're destroying it for all time, right? So what's that called? Sustainable living, or something called?
But when there's a conflict like that, how is there like a, I don't know what the right word is, but how would someone go about deciphering what to do in that type of thing?
You study the topic and you make the best decision you can based on your knowledge and taking into account all the different ramifications, weighing out the different values. Of course, there's value to heating your home and driving your car. There's a value, but we have to balance out that value with the other value. I think that there's so much emotions that I wasn't even allowed to say the basic principle that we should care for the environment because, I said the word environment. Oh my gosh, I'm a liberal leftist and progressive and I'm going to say, tomorrow I'm going to say we can't have industrialized clothing and I don't want to have cars on the street. It's so divided nowadays that the basic principle, I think, is that there are competing values. The value of caring for the environment is a mitzvah from the Torah. How to balance that out against other values, of course, is quite complicated on the global scale. And then on the individual scale, we'll have to see that we're going to talk about the basic mitzvah of not cutting down a fruit tree and some of the details about not doing things which waste, not doing things. There's a new law in Israel that just gave a very, very high tax on disposable dishes and cutlery, plasticware, and there's a big debate about it. It was done for environmental purposes, but it's very hurtful to specifically one portion of the population.
Students.
Many families that have lots of children, they use disposable dishes because it's just impossible otherwise to manage a household of 15 people and 3 meals a day, and of course yeshivot to serve hundreds of maybe even thousands of students 3 meals a day, and they don't have the manpower, they don't have the dishwashers, they don't have so it's a real change in the system, and change in the system is always hard, and it's a balance. You have to find the right balance between just cutting things. I'm going to go around and take everybody's questions, but I'm going to get to you, Ezra, in a second. No, I'm waiting patiently, semi-patiently.
Two things. One, when I put my hand up, I don't expect to be answered straight away. It's just to let you know.
Thank you.
And when you said you can't cut down a tree or fruit tree unless it benefits you, and then we talked.
And there's no other better way.
We talked about pikuach nefesh. All these kinds of things where you can do it if it helps you. How do we navigate the space in between?
Today is what day of the week?
Tuesday.
Tuesday. So it means our next halacha class is Sunday. All right, Wednesday we do tefillah.
Unless we
So
forget.
Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, unless we forget. So it happened only once, I think, maybe twice. Okay. But that's been a few months now. Not bad, twice in a few months. Sunday next week, we're going to go and continue with the details of these laws of cutting down fruit trees. Okay? Another question, Ezra?
So you said that a lot of people who have a lot of kids use disposable plates.
Yes.
How many people here from here? Because it doesn't look like there's a lot.
I don't know, but I do know that if you compare what happens in Israel, where like every supermarket has, shelves, entire rows.
Disposable.
There's stores devoted to disposable dishes and cutlery, whereas when you go to most cities in Europe, you can maybe find a fork and a half, like in very small packages of disposable dishes, and they're like very high priced. And there's a real change in the culture of the society, obviously also by government laws, and they use a lot less disposable. And it's a big question how to get from point A to point B, but that should ultimately be our goal, to not increase the pollution. I think that's a good thing. Yes, David, another question.
It's interesting how there can be different sized issues. So I grew up on the East Coast. You're much better off washing things than having disposables. And then I lived in California, and one of the counties put a very high tax on disposable diapers. They want people to use cloth.
Wow.
But what ended up happening is it became a problem because there's only so much water, and they ended up running out of their water, the amount of water they're supposed to have. And so I was suggesting that to somebody in Israel the other day that this thing is actually going to backfire. But then they reminded me we have desalination. We've got all the water we need. We don't need to conserve water. We have to worry about plastic.
I think we still have issues in terms of the natural rainwater which comes.
But we have desalination, so we don't have any water.
Desalination, you have to remember,
Yeah,
no, we
so
don't
sea
have,
salt to wash
first of
the
all, desalination doesn't give us unlimited. It costs money to desalinate.
also bad for the
And it only used for human uses, but it doesn't change the rivers and the springs.
Right.
Right, desalination,
But if you
nobody's
people-
piping desalinated water back into like the.
Right, but if I use
Doesn't
50
really-
gallons, if I use 50 gallons of water to wash dishes, that's a renewable resource, and who cares, as opposed to the plastic.
Okay, if you have 100% from desal, but usually we don't. Usually the tap water is not desalinated
Do
water.
we care about water here? Is it an issue?
We do. It's less of it than it used to be because we're world leaders in desalination, but it's still an issue and we still have to conserve water. Every year, the government spends millions of shekels for public relations to teach the public that we have to conserve our water, despite having.
Is this something we should protest?
Not at all, not at all. I think that it's very hard to see the big picture. And especially when it's like you're down at the bottom of the mountain, you're looking at myself, I said, well, I've got everything I need. But when you see the big picture on the national scale and then even on the global scale, then you get sensitive to issues which you might not be aware of. So I wouldn't make light of these issues. Yes?
Sorry, another question, kind of the same idea. It's like, I've heard like the argument from some people that like when Mashiach comes, like what we do now doesn't really matter because when Mashiach comes, everything will be like perfect and great. So kind of like no matter how much we waste or do this or that.
That statement is so anti-Jewish. I don't want to ask even who said it.
I've heard Angela say
Terrible.
we're only here for 6,000 years, so or less. So we don't worry about.
My question is kind of like, what do you say to that?
That's horrible.
What do we quote? How do we respond to that within Torah? I too have heard this.
And like from this, like, and not to like point fingers at anyone, but like I see this more. I feel like that's more from like a very like Haredi communities that kind of an attitude. Again, obviously not all, but generally speaking.
I would go back to Bereshit chapter 1, where God creates the world and He places man and creates the Garden of Eden. And He places man, and the first thing He tells him, your job is le'ovda u'leshomra. Your job is to till the land. Le'ovda is to work the land, to cultivate the earth that I gave you. U'leshomra, and to guard it, and to guard this Garden of Eden that I gave you. So it's a very, very basic principle in the Torah that our job on earth is to develop and cultivate the land, and for society to develop and to grow and to invest in that. This is the basis of the entire story of Bereshit. So I can't think of anything to try to live in the future. Try to think, well, Mashiach's going to come anyways, and therefore what I do doesn't make any sense. Well, the whole concept of we have 613 mitzvot. Who knows what mitzvah will be when Mashiach comes? So we don't have to do the mitzvot either. If you have to be careful about the mitzvah, you have to be careful about this world. The mitzvah we're given for this world. And this is one of the mitzvah which is teaching us. Care for the environment is one of the principles of the Torah. 100%. I think that everything that we do now is what I think they asked a guru once, there was a group of Hasidim that were looking for a Hasidic Rebbe, and they decided to ask the same question to a number of different Rebbes. And the question was, they went to one Rebbe and to the next Rebbe, and they asked him the question, what's the most important mitzvah in the Torah? And each Rebbe gave him a different answer. This one said learning Torah, this one said putting out davening, this one said whatever it is. And they kept looking because they didn't really feel a connection. They didn't feel that was the right answer. Finally, they got to, I forget which Rebbe it is, I apologize. And they asked him, what's the most important mitzvah in the Torah? And you know what he said? He said, the one that I'm doing right now.
Oh,
And there's tremendous truth in that. We have our job to live as Jews now, to be the best Jew I can be today. And that's what's going to bring the Mashiach. And what's going to happen when He comes, we'll leave it up to Him. But right now, we have to follow the guidelines of the Torah, and that is to treat the world with respect, to develop the world, to cultivate the world, of course, to daven and to learn and to do chesed between each other. But we can't ignore this world and say, oh, we're just sort of in a holding pattern until Mashiach comes. That's so anti-Jewish, in my opinion. But
Can we destroy some place like Iran? Can we destroy Stom?
to defend yourself.
Stom doesn't exist, but Iran, I hope so, because they're trying to kill us. So kill them before being killed. So, anyways, we'll stop here and we'll continue. So next week, the laws of Bal Tashchit. Thank you.